Welcome to River Life Podcasts. We're a church family embracing the Father's presence, releasing empowered people to declare and demonstrate Christ's kingdom. We trust that God would use what you hear today to bless and grow you so that you would be a blessing to those around you. For more information about River Life Baptist Church, go to riverlifechurch.org.au or find us on social media.
So there's the face of a man, the face of an ox, the face of a lion, and the face of an eagle. And so I think from memory, Matthew is about the lion being the Jewish perspective, the Lion of Judah. Mark being the ox or the bull, because Jesus came as a humble servant, so no family tree, no heritage that we're aware of. Luke is the man, because he's the Son of Man in Luke. He's presenting the humanity of Christ with his divinity also present. And then John, the eagle, the high
above the
view.
world.
Yes. Yeah.
Because
John does have a biography. It has a family tree. It's just his divine family tree. Hello and welcome to Bible Streams. This is a podcast all about the Bible, digging deep, giving us some critical tools to understand what we read and how to apply it to our life. My name is Joe. I'm one of the people here at River Life Church whose job and passion it is to read and teach the Bible. I'm joined by Alex, who I think I could say that's a similar thing for you, right?
Yes, similar passion for me too.
It's what we do. Today we are starting a new series all about the Gospels, which I'm excited about. I don't know, are you excited about this?
Absolutely. We just spent, who knows how many episodes.
Many
in the Psalms. So
several.
It's probably time for a change of scenery, probably for you guys as well. So the Gospels.
Here we go. We're going to spend some time looking at each Gospel and kind of walking through them, taking a bit of a higher level view. We won't dig in too deep, but we'll give some of the big kind of themes and movements and some specifics that are important out of each gospel. But today we're going to talk through some introductory themes and concepts that will help you understand the gospels generally as the introduction to the New Testament, because they're the first ones we find, right? Like, that's what we get when we start the New Testament. Most people go, well, if I don't start at Genesis, I'll start at Matthew. And, well, we might even answer the question, is Matthew the best place to start?
I think we will answer that question.
I think we will. There's a good choice. And no spoilers, you'll find out. It's either yes or no. But why is really the value, depending on the answer. And we'll talk a little bit about the culture that we find ourselves in when we're reading the New Testament scriptures. So I think this will help you kind of get some grounding kind of ideas to help read. So as we jump in, we're going to jump into how we got the New Testament in just a moment. But Alex, for you, as we kind of approach the Gospels, what are the things that you always find people are asking when we come to reading the Gospels? When you talk to people about the Bible, what are their thoughts? What are their questions? What do you find are the things you always have to answer?
Well, the communities I'm usually discussing this in at uni, the questions are usually coming from a secular perspective.
Yeah, right.
Usually trying to untangle the coherency of the Bible. So most of the questions I get about this are inconsistencies between accounts, trying to prove the historical Jesus. And we'll talk about the synoptic issue and how the first three Gospels marry up really nicely. And what that means, how John's a bit different. But yeah,
both his gospel and as a person, it seems.
Exactly, yeah. He seems like a bit of a weirdo, to be honest.
Hey, I think he's a cool guy.
It's my favorite gospel, so it's okay.
Okay, good. Okay, phew.
But yeah, lots and lots of questions about the shared material in between the Synoptic Gospels and the different stories that we find repeating, and perhaps the ones that we don't see repeated.
And where those stories are different too. Which is
exactly.
Yeah. And I think from a faith perspective, I know when people are really searching out like their faith and like really wrestling as they kind of come to grips, probably as a more mature thinker around their faith, is like, can we trust that these were Jesus's words? How do we know? Can we trust that these are reliable sources? And all those kind of things. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the genre of gospel. So that will be also helpful, I think. But without any further ado, let's jump into this episode of Jesus Stories, looking at an introduction to the Gospels.
Okay, so first we're going to look at how we got the New Testament canon and the formation and the literary background that sort of led to us having the Gospels in our Bibles today as we read them as the first 4 books of the New Testament. Because as we know, or hopefully we know, that for the New Testament characters, for Jesus and the disciples, their scriptures were not the scriptures we have in terms of the New Testament.
Yes.
Their scriptures were primarily the Old Testament. And until the completion of the New Testament canon, the apostles' teaching on the words and life of Jesus was considered authoritative, as we would consider the Bible today. Authoritative. So the way we got about those words of Jesus from the apostles and the transmissions into their letters is really the point of contention, but we know there's a bit of history of oral transmission and also a little bit of literary transmission as well.
Yes, and we'll get to I have a question about canon as well. Well, I know about canon, but we'll talk about why we use this weird word canon. But yeah, so the oral transmission is the first part, right? So this is what really got me when I first started to read the history of this is the thing, the Bible is history in a way, which we'll talk about because it is history, but it's curated history, which is really important to know. But as you start to read history about how we got this record of history, it's very interesting. So it actually wasn't the Gospels that were written down first. Like, so everyone's telling stories of Jesus, and we know from Paul's writings as he travels, he's telling stories about Jesus. He even writes in 1 Corinthians about how he passed on to people what was told to him as of first importance in 1 Corinthians 11 about the Lord's Supper. So there's probably a significant period of time where people are telling stories or writing letters about what happened in the events of Jesus' life, right? So we got a fair bit of time, which for me, initially when I first heard this, I was like, that's not particularly reliable. Like, there's like the better part of 50 years of people just telling the stories with just speaking about it, not writing it down. I'm like, hang on a second. But it's actually, we run into the issue of kind of writing back onto history our current cultural practices, right, around memory and recording things.
Yeah, exactly. It is a bit shocking when you first hear that the Gospels were written after all of the epistles and stuff like that.
Yeah, so Paul was writing before any of the Gospel writers.
Exactly. And you talked about that Corinthians example. There's another example in Acts where Paul encourages the Ephesian elders to heed the words of Jesus when he says that it's more blessed to give than to receive.
Yeah,
but
which is
you don't find that anywhere in the Gospels. So clearly there was a process of oral transmission.
Like, what Gospel was Paul reading?
Yeah, exactly.
Burn him.
Some people might say that.
So, yeah.
But like you were saying, we do have a tendency to impose our own cultural biases and norms onto the culture in which the Bible was written. And if you're in church a couple of weeks ago from when we were recording this, when John was talking about disciples and the importance of a disciple in the ancient culture, there was a huge emphasis on the memorization and rote learning culture. And the function of a disciple was literally to record and memorize and pass on the words of their teacher and to know them faithfully, let alone all of the Old Testament scripture as well.
Right.
So,
and that was the thing. So like the fact that the disciples were working implies that they weren't necessarily the best Torah students, Torah being the law, the first 5 books, right?
Correct.
So they maybe weren't great at it, but that was their only job, was to remember what Jesus said.
And you see in Mark that some of his Greek really wasn't that great.
Yes. We'll get on to Mark's gospel in a little while. But yes, Mark's not the most elegant Greek, as it turns out. But so we moved through this, and the way that I actually learned about it, and it struck me, I was sitting in a lecture on the Old Testament, and they're talking about the oral transmission of the Old Testament and the stories of Moses that were passed down from when it happened through to when they wrote it down, which could have been centuries and centuries later. Exploring the idea of oral transmission, like so people speaking and hearing and remembering, the fact that it always happened in community to me kind of made me realize it was actually almost like if you've done a Passover everyone knows the story of the Passover, but one person tells the story, and it happens every year. So everyone remembers. And from your earliest memory for a Jewish person, there's this Passover Seder, which actually tells the story of the Exodus, which is parts of scripture and parts of cultural stuff. But everyone knows when you get it right and when you get it wrong. And so the one person might have been recounting the stories of Jesus, but everyone who was there heard them. And so there's kind of like this self-policing as well as the community hears the story. So it kind of struck me that actually oral transmission and spoken kind of memory of these events is almost like a informal Wikipedia, in that it's actually kind of like crowd corrected. Like everyone who's hearing it, who knows the story, go, hey, you got that bit wrong. You said it wrong. You got to fix it. It goes this way. And so it's actually kind of self-policing in that sense, because it wasn't just one messenger. It was the 12 disciples. It was the 120 disciples who were in the upper room. It was the people that, had encountered Jesus, who knew the Jewish scriptures. And so all of these kind of conversations were always self-policed in those senses because people knew the stories.
Yeah, exactly. And even then, you're only going to get you're going to get a few minor deviations as the length of time progresses and stories change through communities slightly, and we probably get that a little bit in the Gospels.
Yeah.
But like you said, the self-policing of those communities definitely makes sure that the stories remain mostly intact to what we assume they originally were. And I've actually got a quote here from a little source we've been using. It is actually historically naive to doubt that Jesus' disciples accurately passed on his teaching, because that's precisely what they were disciples for.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Dr. Hussey.
If you exactly, thanks, Ian.
Reverend Dr. Hussey.
If you have any doubts or questions over whether that 50-year period or so before the words were written down means that those words remain accurate, given the displacement from when Jesus actually spoke them, we can probably put your mind at ease a little bit. Sure, there might have been minor changes and differences, but for the most part, the oral transmission culture in these communities was very sound. And
I'm reminded instantly of growing up and having many people tell me these facts, and I obviously cannot recall them right now when I need them, but from memory, there's actually a shorter lag time between Jesus's life and the record of his sayings and his teachings and his life than there is between, I think, any other kind of ancient figure. So like the lag time between Julius Caesar living and the records of his life is a lot longer than Jesus. And so actually it's only in isolation that we see these as issues, because in the ancient world and the record of the ancient world, this is actually a pretty small time frame within, a couple of decades, within definitely one lifetime
that's right.
of Jesus's actual physical life on earth, which leads us into the second stage. So there's letters, there's people talking, there's people walking around the ancient world telling others about Jesus, but we kind of hit a point around the start of the 2nd century, which is around 100 AD, just before or just after, where we actually start to get people not just writing them down, but collecting them together, right? Like all these letters and these stories of Jesus, which is kind of, what do we call that? The second stage? Is it like
writing and collection, the first proto-canons kind of ideas?
Right?
Yeah. So we've got about 3 notable ones that sort of look like they put together a few of the books. None of them really hit the mark.
No.
In terms of what...
Well, one was okay.
One was okay. The first one, if you've heard of Marcion before, we would call him a heretic now. He thought the gods of the Old Testament and the New Testament were different and opposed each other. So his canon included none of the Old Testament.
And also didn't include the Gospels, because they talked about the God of the Old Testament.
He only included a tiny bit of Luke that had no Old Testament scripture in it, and like a few of Paul's letters. So
he was a follower of Paul, and so obviously big fan.
So
put them right up front.
Marcion's canon,
not great,
but
it does speak to the fact that people were starting to collect together what we now consider the New Testament as some kind of significant, or maybe, as we find out in a few centuries, authoritative texts regarding the life and the work of Christ. Yeah, so the second one is the Muratorian Canon, which was kind of mid-2nd century, somewhere in there, where pretty much had most of what we would consider today to be significant. So it had all 4 Gospels.
It's a good start compared
Matthew,
to
Mark,
Marcion.
Luke and John. Had Luke's second part to his story, Acts, which we've already done on Bible streams, which you all know about. A couple of letters of John, a bunch of Paul's letters, even Jude and Revelation. So, which is, one of the later books. So it's getting pretty good. No Hebrews, no James, but
missing
other than that,
Timothy,
Timothy,
maybe some of the Timothys
Titus
and Peters are missing, but the that's pretty solid considering his predecessor.
Yeah.
And the final one that is noteworthy is around the same time, about 170 AD. It's called the Diatessaron.
Great name.
It is a great name.
Sounds like something from Doctor Who.
I'm not that familiar with Doctor
maybe
Who,
Marvel.
but I'll take your word for it.
Does the Diatessaron have an Infinity Stone in it?
That's from Marvel, right?
Yeah.
Okay. No, but it does have an interweaving of the 4 Gospels. So if you've read more than one Gospel or read them back to back or anything, you'll see that they follow, especially the first 3, follow very similar patterns and stuff like that. So this author Tatian attempted to, I think, make a chronological sort of interweaving account of the Gospels. Oh, yeah. You do?
I do. It's all together, and so it's really weird. So firstly, it's someone's opinion of what order the events happened in, because as we get to talking about the Gospels, it's not necessarily chronological. And obviously, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are, as we will also talk about soon, drawing on some similar stories. And so you kind of read the same story 3 or 4 times in a row, and then you're going to go somewhere else entirely. Then all of a sudden you read the same thing over and over again. So it's helpful for comparing, but really almost a bit frustrating. But the Diatessaron was helpful because it started to actually record all of this clearly for everyone.
Yeah, that's right. Obviously, if you know anything about church history, the formation of the canon and what was inspired and not inspired and was authoritative was a huge talking point amongst the different centers of the early church and led to heaps and heaps of conflict and councils and stuff like that. So
we kind of, when you get to the kind of middle of the first century, so like AD 150 to 170, everything's kind of been generally just kicking along all right, and people are like, we don't necessarily agree. There's a few heretics coming up here and there, but everyone's kind of getting along. As soon as you hit kind of about the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, it's like, oh, hang on, let's just fight about everything.
Yeah, exactly.
And let's take a long time to make any decisions. I'm thankful for the length of time they considered things. I'm not thankful for how much they fought about it. But, you know, we got the Bible out of it.
I was going to say, we've got the Bible now, so it all worked out according to God's plan, right?
Yes. So we hit that kind of that 3rd stage, which is actually a couple of centuries worth of people actually now canonizing Scripture. Now, canon is not an implement of warfare. It's not a thing that fires shells across. Well, it is that, but we spell this canon C-A-N-O-N, which is actually, now correct me if I'm wrong, is it Latin for rule?
It's Latin for rule or reed.
Yes.
So originally referred to a reed, which then became a term.
As in like a straw.
Yeah. And which then became a term of measurement, like a rule. So
it's actually the formal collection of Scripture. So it's like the rule of Scripture, right?
It's like the Old Testament's plumb line. It's like what you measured everything against the canon to see if it was heretical or not.
So as we get to this place of canonization, developing the rule of Scripture for the New Testament, it doesn't really start to happen until around kind of the 300s, right, which is like the 4th century. So Athanasius was the first guy who was the Bishop of Alexandria in North Africa. He was the first one to kind of really have what we have as the New Testament today. But this is an interesting thing about this. They might think that the New Testament wasn't official until this point, but everyone already considered the writings authoritative prior to this, because they've been in circulation for a couple hundred years. It wasn't until now that people felt the need to actually kind of collect it together to really battle it out. And so around 367, my notes say, he had a letter that he wrote at Easter that said, here's all the books that I think should be in the New Testament, all the letters, all the writings that should be in there. And so that was after the Council of Nicaea, which was 325.
Yep.
And before the other councils that started to actually play this out. So there's all sorts of stuff going on at the time, because Athanasius is known for the Arian controversy.
Yeah.
Which, do you remember?
Absolutely.
Come on.
Poor Athanasius, much maligned over his life. The poor guy was exiled 5 times. Throughout his career by, I think, 5 different Roman emperors or something. It's unbelievable. So, the poor guy was up against the Arian controversy. So
he's okay with Constantine to begin with.
Yeah, that's true.
Constantine was okay with Athanasius.
I still think Constantine exiled him at some point. I think so.
I think he just exiled everyone.
It went south at some point.
It's like the reverse Oprah. You get an exile and you get an exile.
Athanasius was a staunch defender of Trinitarianism and the doctrine of the Trinity, which was put forward by several notable people before him. But the Arian controversy led by Arius was that the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus and stuff like that all played out. They were against that kind of idea. So Athanasius was a staunch defender of that, but wasn't in many people's good books because of it. So he had a real tough time at some of these councils and hence got exiled a lot. But he's very famous now. His nickname was Athanasius Against the World. It's like, that's what
cool.
That's what they called him in
Like,
Latin back in the day.
A T-shirt with that on it.
He got exiled so many times
Should
that
make
people
Bible
started.
Streams T-shirts.
Oh, we should.
Athanasius Against the World.
Yeah. Yeah. Imagine being famous and your nickname is Against the World. That's
man.
pretty cool.
I think maybe we should do a series at some point on like early church heresies and controversies.
I would
That'd
love
be
that.
really interesting. Athanasius is kind of the last, well, not the last, but the present canonizing person in a long line of disciples, which we can actually measure kind of all the way back to Jesus' disciples, because particularly of note, so John, the disciple he discipled a guy called Polycarp, great name.
I think it's hilarious every time I hear that name.
Polycarp, who then seemed to disciple Irenaeus, who was one of the early church fathers. So this is all in what's called the patristic period of the church, where they had the fathers, patristic
church fathers.
Yeah, church fathers. And so this kind of gets passed on. So these disciples, there's a fairly clear and unbroken line of succession of people who were discipled by someone who was discipled by someone back to Jesus. And so there's a fairly, even though it's a couple of centuries by this point, there's really strong connections. There's really strong writings. A guy called Eusebius collected a lot of these early writings, and you can actually get translations of his material today, which is really helpful because you can read like Clement, who was one of the first generation disciples after Jesus's 12, who was writing about the stories of that was passed on to him. A lot of these early guys, Justin Martyr wrote as well, who was a first generation disciple of the disciples. And so all of this kind of led to how they discussed what should be in and what should be out. So there was things that missed out, like the shepherd of Hermas missed out.
Yeah, which Athanasius actually included in a list in the same letter that he said, this is a book that should be read, but not as part of the canon. So he
the
actually,
Epistle of Barnabas was around too.
There's lots of those.
He didn't get much play.
The Book of Esther he included in that list as well. He didn't think should be part of the Old Testament. And then other ones like the Book of Baruch, Judith, Tobit, the ones you might know from the Apocrypha today.
Yep.
Good old Athanasius said, you should read these, but not.
Like they're helpful for instruction, but not authoritative.
Yeah, exactly.
So, which is good advice. Maybe if you've never read them. Interesting.
But he got the 27 New Testament books as we know them today were on his first official canon list. And
he gets the prize.
It's kind of been like that ever since.
Yeah. So that was about around the late 300s. And so kind of since then, we've just had really just different translations going back to the different sources of the original text. So that's kind of that, which really nicely leads us onto our next discussion, which is kind of what is the nature of these particular books in the New Testament, which we call the Gospels. So we'll discuss that in a moment. Okay, so let's jump in and look at kind of some of the things around the genre of gospel, the way that we got our gospels, we think, because it's not necessarily an exact science, but there's theories. And then kind of, we'll look at what synoptic means and a few other things like that. So first up, the nature of gospel. So the genre of gospels. So interesting word you just found out.
Yeah, so I mean, we all know gospel means good news, right? But the etymology of the word actually surprised me. It's from Anglo-Saxon originally, and the word was Godspell. There you go.
Hence the musical Godspell.
Okay, I'm not familiar. But
70s musical Godspell.
You expect me to know 70s
it's
musical?
Amazing. Okay. It's famous. It's quite famous. I think it's still probably playing on Broadway. Well, if Broadway's open, who knows these days. But yes.
All right, well, that aside, the Anglo-Saxon word Godspell has no connection to the Greek word for gospel, euangelion.
Yep.
So, anyway, we know the word gospel means good news.
Yeah. And so, it's interesting because so when we get to things like Paul's letters, there's a genre of ancient letter. And so they always had greetings and salutations and some shared history and things like that, blah, blah, blah. Paul kind of sticks to it, but breaks it when he wants. When we get to the Old Testament, there's particular forms for histories and writings and things like that. Turns out there's actually a genre of ancient biographies, which the Gospels kind of fit into. So here you go. Well, I'll run through one person. I think it's Powell's checklist of ancient biographies, and you'll see where the Gospels kind of meet up or not. So the first characteristic would be no pretense of detached objectivity. So is it an unbiased account? What do we think, Gospels? Yes or no? I think it's quite biased. It's obviously presenting Jesus exactly as the Son of God. It's not kind of go, what are the facts and will we make our own decision? Although Mark's Gospel, you could argue.
That's true. But all in all, they're pretty unapologetic about their,
so I say
their
Ed agrees
motivation
there.
in this regard.
Yeah.
Yep.
No concern for establishing facts like evidence or sources.
We sort of disagreed with this one in the sense that especially Luke's Gospel is very keen on establishing the facts, and he even makes it clear that he's been through his facts later, which we might look a bit more when we talk about the gospel sources.
Sounds good. Number 3, little attention to historical data like names and places and dates and things like that. I don't know. I feel like you learn all about Herod the Tetrarch. You learn about various other real historical figures.
I appreciate you saying Herod the Tetrarch rather than King Herod, since he was never a king. There you go. That's the attention to historical detail that the gospel authors
exactly right
and Joe did.
Yes. Little attention to chronology of events. Ooh, that's an interesting one.
This one's probably more true than it's not true. The Gospels and the authors are quite liberal with their structuring and the chronology of events. Some of it definitely follows some pattern. Obviously, he's born at the start of the book and dies near the end of the book. Yeah. But anything that happens in between is pretty much up for grabs.
What about attention to the development of the subject's thought? I don't know. Yeah, I think so. We kind of see it kind of progress. Definitely see a progression in Jesus's intention. So he definitely at one point, like in Luke's Gospel, decides now it's time to head to Jerusalem for the big kind of showdown to finish it all off. Next one, no psychological interest in the subject's inner motivations. I think you do.
I think so as well. It's a bit of an abstract wording. It's a bit tricky to work out what that means, but he's doing it because he's God.
Yeah, so, and I think we find that out from the text. Yeah. So an ancient biography seems to not care about the inner life of the hero or the subject. It was more the outer life and the outer working. But I think in the Gospels, they're different there. We get a lot of insight into the inner workings of who Jesus is. Anecdotal style of narration, definitely. Absolutely. We just get stories. We don't get a full, and on his 623rd day of ministry, he went to this place and had this for lunch. We don't get that. Which some people that's what they think history is. It's non-curated. It's just indiscriminate. But an ancient biography and the Gospels are quite selected in their content. Number 7, emphasis on the subject's character and defining traits.
You'd have to say so.
A little bit. And interesting also where it is in conflict with the kind of established culture of his time. We see a lot of his character come out in that space. Consistent focus on the subject's philosophy of life. I would probably say something, a little thing like the Sermon on the Mount might suggest we know Jesus' philosophy of life.
Beatitudes, etc.
Yeah, or Beatitudes, isn't it?
I've never heard it said like that version before. Yeah. Oh, is it? Okay.
Bible jokes everywhere. See, it's the freebies you get today. Strong interest on the subject's death as consistent with their philosophy of life.
It's a tough one, but
I'd suggest yes.
Yes, yep. That is very consistent.
Do you concur?
Absolutely.
Great, excellent. Presentation of the subject as worthy of emulation, of following, of modelling after.
Once again, that's pretty unapologetic.
Yep, very, very much so. Depiction of the subject as superior to his rivals or his competitors, which I think yes, actually. Yep. You pointed out that we see like in Luke 4, right?
Mm-hmm. We get Jesus' temptation in the desert where he's quite clearly contrasted to Satan and how specifically the use of God's word is used to overcome the misinterpretation of it. So quite clear battle there.
Yep. I also thought too, and you probably don't pick this up until a little after the fact, particularly from reading Acts, and which kind of counts almost as a gospel in that it's a continuing story of Luke's gospel. But in Paul's writings too, that there's a very clear contrast between Jesus and Caesar as Lord. Even the fact that Jesus is Lord is a phrase that is used is kind of a big kind of, thumbing of the nose at Caesar as Lord. So that's, I think that works.
Yeah, the terminology of Lord and Messiah all through the Gospels. In and of itself,
And last one, overall concern with the subject's legacy, evident in the followers who carry on the tradition.
Well, like you were just saying, Acts is an extension of Luke's gospel. It makes it pretty clear that,
2,000 years later, we're sitting here talking about him, so
it's true.
That counts.
Did its job. Yeah.
So we can see there's a lot of similarities with an ancient biography, but a little bit different too. And because it's not just a historical record, it's actually curated for a reason. So part of those last things about a life worth emulating, a legacy worth following, these are obviously part of what the ancient biographies were about, but there's something a little bit different with the Gospels, which we see the Bible authors constantly breaking the model.
Yeah, and just wanted to touch on one of those small differences. Definitely the ancient biographies, especially the Roman ones that probably post-dated Jesus just a little bit. All of Plutarch's lives, if you're familiar with any of them, they're like the best, most pure example of an ancient biography. They're the most famous, and they were always concerned with more cherry-picking facts and events and anecdotes to portray the subject of the biography in either a pleasurable or, not so great light, depending on Plutarch's opinion of them. It was usually great. But I see in the Gospels, obviously we don't have every single word recorded that Jesus ever said, or probably every story
we know that
of his life.
John's Gospel.
And we know that, exactly. But like you said before, Jesus' clash with culture is not something you'd include in an ancient biography if you were wholeheartedly set out on portraying them as favorable rather than simply as truthful. And it's really the divinity of Jesus and his character as the Son of God that, pulls him over the line where he can afford to and should clash with culture since he's not of this world. But no ancient biography would ever want to portray someone like that. Yeah.
Not at all. Which I think just really speaks into the larger conversation that one of the really compelling reasons for the Bible to be trustworthy, as well as its historical, sources and the way that its credibility is established at an academic level, is the fact that it portrays all of the characters kind of warts and all, inside and out. So
exactly.
The good and the bad. So, Jesus says things that makes his followers leave, which you wouldn't really want to portray in a biography of a hero who's going to be like the poster person for the next generation to follow, like saying things or being crucified like a criminal, not a great
doesn't look good
example.
for you, does it?
Yeah. So, things like that I think actually speak to the historicity of these things, because you wouldn't put them in.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, you don't tell everyone's horrible stories at their eulogy, do you?
No.
Okay, cool. So that helps. Now, when we come to the 4 Gospels that we have, why 4? This becomes the question. People go, why do we have 4 Gospels? Shouldn't we just have one? Who was it? Tacitus? No, Tatian. Who was the one who wrote the Diatessaron?
Tatian.
He was like, we only need one. Let's just blend it together.
And he had a really long one. So.
One really long one, which isn't really blending it together. It's just cutting and pasting. But so 4 Gospels. Interesting.
Yeah, so obviously 4 Gospels, 4 authors, 4 different time periods, more or less. They're all about the same time-ish, in the same, anyway, we'll get to that later. And 4 different audiences, really, as well. So the 4 Gospels, in their cultural context of the day, would have been understood very differently, once again, to how we read them today. If we read all 4 Gospels back-to-back, it's going to be very different to an ancient reader reading all 4 Gospels back to back. So
like at high level, what are we talking then? So Matthew seems to be for a Jewish audience.
Yep, mostly for a Jewish audience. Most people would say Mark is closer to a Gentile audience. There's a lot of Gentile references being grafted in that we don't find in Matthew. Luke's kind of straddles the line a bit, and he's known as a bit more of a scientific gospel. Very high Greek and attention to details and facts. And then John is just otherworldly, to put it that way. It's a bit more of a vertical gospel than it is.
I like that.
In the line. But when we get to the episodes for each of them, we might dig deeper.
We won't rob ourselves from later on.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's helpful. So 4 different audiences, 4 different authors. And I think you're right. We get a different picture of Jesus a little bit.
From each of them,
the facets of Jesus. We turn the diamond and see a different facet in each gospel.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Some people say reflective of things like the 4 different faces of the living creatures in the Old Testament prophets. So in Ezekiel.
Heard that before. Interesting.
So there's the face of a man, the face of an ox, the face of a lion, and the face of an eagle. And so I think from memory, Matthew is about the lion being the Jewish perspective, the Lion of Judah. Mark being the ox or the bull, because Jesus came as a humble servant, so no family tree, no heritage that we're aware of. Luke is the man because he's the Son of Man in Luke. He's presenting the humanity of Christ with his divinity also present. And then John, the eagle, the high
above the
view.
world.
Yes. Yeah. Because John does have a biography. It has a family tree. It's just his divine family tree.
Yes, as
in the
opposed
beginning
to the
was
more
the word.
human family trees. Yeah.
So you get those kind of perspectives as well. So some people connect those dots, that the prophets were seeing the Gospels beforehand with these living creatures and 4 views of Jesus.
So fascinating.
Anyway, there's lots of little red herrings and little eddies you can follow down there, which is helpful. But I think what helps get our head around the fact that there's 4 different gospel accounts is that when we start to look at the sources of these gospels, because as you said earlier, and as anyone who's read any of the gospels knows, there's a lot of repetition, mainly in the first 3, but there's also some stuff that shows up in all 4. So we get this idea that you said earlier, the Synoptic Gospels, which is a very technical term, meaning...
Yes, so synopsis, as we understand the word, is like, if
an overview, right?
An overview or a summary. Similar, in the Greek, it means to see together or to view together as a whole. So you can see how that meaning's been extrapolated today. So when we refer to the Synoptic Gospels, we're talking about the first 3, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it's because, if you read them, they are very similar. And they work together to give a pretty united picture of Jesus. And when we talk about John in the episode on John, you'll find that John is quite different in a lot of ways to the Synoptic Gospels, where the Synoptics are similar. John is often very different. So when we refer to the Synoptic Gospels, it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it leads us to this idea of having sources for the Gospels because of the amount of shared material between the 3.
Yeah, so this was why we talked about the traditions that were passed on, about how we got the scripture, because there's obviously a lot of conversations happening about Jesus within those who followed Jesus, even those who didn't follow Jesus but were there at the time. So there's lots of conversation. Luke talks about it.
Yeah, I've got the verse here. So these are the first 4 verses of Luke's entire gospel. And he says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us." So people are already writing about it, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So there's your oral transmission again. "With this in mind, since myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, so that you may know the certainty of things that you've been taught." So Luke's actually trawled back through the oral transmission and the eyewitness accounts and what's already been written to conduct his own gospel.
It's very interesting. So this is what we're faced with, and this is what scholars wrestle with. And so when you're reading the gospel accounts like Luke's, which is an orderly and well thought out presentation of the life of Jesus, which then flows on to Acts, which says, in my previous account, dear Theophilus, lover of God, that's what Theophilus means, isn't it? Lover of God.
Philo, Theo, yeah.
I might even remember my Greek. Let's just keep working. So there's this kind of, when we look at the Gospels, there's a whole bunch of stuff that Mark and Matthew and Luke have in common. There's significant amounts of it actually, but things like Jesus on the water. So Jesus crossing the water. So it's in Mark 4, it's also in Matthew 8, and it's in Luke 8. And they're very similar. Like the language is similar. Mark's is slightly longer. Matthew's is slightly shorter. Luke's in the middle. They're pretty similar, but there's slight changes. And so we're like, well, it seems to be fairly obvious that they're sharing a common source there.
Yeah.
So the initial thought was, and we'll get to this in a little more depth in a moment, that pretty much Matthew and Luke seem to use Mark. Because Mark's is the least elegant Greek, and you wouldn't think you'd make your language worse if you're copying someone else. And it shows up in Mark, also shows up in Matthew, shows up in Luke. They're a little bit longer in the other one, so they've elaborated a little bit, or they remember something different. And so there's this idea that there was 2 sources. There was Mark, who wrote potentially his Peter's gospel, or maybe Paul, depending on who you talk to. That one of the early, it's an early account of Jesus. And then there seems to be this other collection of parts of Matthew and Luke which are in common but not from Mark.
Yes. So Mark has no knowledge of it.
Yeah. So, and you think, well, if Mark knew, he'd put it in.
Yeah.
So this is what scholars have helpfully labelled Q.
Presumably because we have no idea what it is.
Yeah. Well, now my memory, if my memory serves me correct, it comes from the German for scroll.
Yes,
Is that right?
All I remembered was it comes from a German word, and
Yes.
that's why it begins with Q, but I don't know what the German word is.
I think it's like quell or something like that. I don't know, but I've probably said it wrong. It's probably the wrong word, but my memory is it's German for, I think, scroll. So there's the missing scroll, which everyone has, which basically contains the passion narratives and the sayings of Jesus, is the theory.
The theory is it's mostly just literally the words that Jesus spoke. It's not so much people writing stories about Jesus. It's literally an account of his teachings, the words he spoke, and the passion narratives.
So, which is the last week of his life. So that's kind of the two-source theory. Well, it's really a hypothesis because they can't prove it because we don't have any of these original documents.
Yeah.
So that
Q has never shown up anywhere.
Q is there, Mark is there, and Matthew and Luke kind of combined the two. What's probably more helpful is because there's actually stuff in Luke that doesn't appear in Mark or Matthew, and there's stuff in Matthew which doesn't appear in Mark or Luke. So actually what's probably more helpful is we probably have come to the point that there's probably 4 sources.
Yes.
So there's Mark early on.
Yep.
Peter or Paul's. Do you think it's Peter or Paul's?
I actually am undecided on this issue.
there
I
you
need to read more about it.
I suspect it's Peter's. But
I err towards Peter at the moment.
Yeah. It's simple, and Peter seemed to be fairly simple in the way he approached things. Not in a bad way, in a helpful way, I think. But anyway, had a very fascinating discussion, slightly off topic here, about Pastor John Robertson and I were discussing on a recent Sunday after we'd been speaking out of the Gospels, teaching about Jesus, about how well do we think Peter and John got on?
True.
Which is absolutely hilarious because if you look in John's Gospel, the account of the storm scene where Peter walks on water, no record of Peter walking on water.
Yeah, I know.
Just not there. Because, one of our favourite preachers' kind of perspective on the walking on water story is always everyone goes he sunk, but let's stop and think, hey, he walked on water for a while. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
John not having a bar of it, not putting that in, don't want to know about it.
John's like, this guy showed no faith and he sank.
Yeah.
He's not even worth it.
Not talking. Constantly, Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved ran, and the disciple whom Jesus loved won the race to the tomb.
Could it be John? Yeah.
At the end, it's like, well, we have Peter's restoration from his giant mess. In John's Gospel, John recounts Peter failed. He failed everyone. You need to know that Peter failed.
It would have been a great soap opera, wouldn't it?
Oh, my goodness. And then you throw Paul into the mix. He just doesn't get on with anyone. So, it's hilarious. Anyway, digression. So the kind of suggestion, the hypothesis that there's 4 sources. So there's Mark.
Yep.
The early Gospel.
The first source.
Q, the teachings of Jesus and his Passion Week, the crucifixion.
Which is found in Matthew and Luke.
Yep. Then there's the L, or Luke, source material.
Unique to Luke.
Yep. And the other M, the Matthew source material.
Unique to Matthew.
Right.
Yep.
So we get these 4 different sources. Luke's stuff, Matthew's stuff, Mark, and Q.
Yes. So
not helpful. Is that John?
It's very confusing. It's
totally.
It's a bit easier if you see a diagram for it. Maybe we can include one in the episode notes.
Or just Google the 4 source hypothesis.
But you get this overall picture at the end. Basically, Mark was written first, we believe.
Yeah.
And Matthew and Luke relied on Mark as a shared source and also relied on Q as a shared source. But Matthew and Luke... Most people think Matthew and Luke didn't know about each other's gospel at the time of writing.
Right. Yep.
Hence, Matthew relied on his own independent material and Luke on his own independent material as well.
Because you would have assumed, had they known of each other's writings, Matthew would have said, I'm calling it the Sermon on the Mount. He goes, I'm going to call it the Sermon on the Plain.
Exactly.
Oh, this is awkward. Do you remember where it was? I wasn't there. No, were you there? Oh, no, I wasn't there either.
This is not good.
Matthew's like, I was there, man. It was on a mountain. We climbed like we got it real early that day. But yes. So that opens up the discussion briefly then for how we think Mark is the first gospel. Because for quite a lot of history, people assumed Matthew was the first gospel because it was
the first
in
one.
order.
Yeah.
So, but now using some fairly kind of logical and common sense reasoning, it seems that Mark is the first one.
It definitely seems that way. And like you said, it is pretty common sense, and now all scholars would agree that. Firstly, the amount of, like we just talked about, the amount of content that Matthew and Luke share from Mark is immense. So in Mark, there's 661 verses. 606 of those are found almost identically in Matthew, and about half of those 660 are also found in Luke. So
lots of common material.
Yeah, a bit of that plagiarism going on.
Not plagiarism. Not back then.
Sorry, not plagiarism. And they were all working together in God's divine plan.
Inspiration. Yeah. We'll talk about that another day.
Mark's gospel is also shorter.
Yep.
And so it wouldn't make much sense for Matthew to write his first, for Mark to use it as a source and then cut out.
Unless it's like the Cliff Notes version.
That's true.
The
literal
Digest
synopsis.
version. I think for me, the most compelling argument is the quality of the Greek. So now I do have Greek, not great Greek, but enough to get by. But definitely Mark is very simple, very, people who know Greek better say it's not as elegant as the others. It's a little clunky. It's a little rough around the edges. For me, as a kind of intermediate Greek student, it's a little simpler.
Yeah.
Which I'm like,
makes it easier to read.
Yeah. I can read Mark in the Greek. This is awesome. But yeah, so it seems logical that if someone were to edit or revise or use document as a source, it wouldn't degrade in quality, even if it did in length. So the Greek of Matthew and Luke is quite elegant. Luke, like you said, is High Greek in its quality and his vocab and things like that. So you'd assume that if Mark was transcribing them,
he probably could have used some of their Greek.
Yeah.
He actually only ever speaks in present tense.
The historical present, yes, which is an interesting thing.
Whereas Matthew and Luke,
I suspect they invented for Mark.
For Mark, yes, because his Greek was not that great.
So there's this idea that when you're learning Greek, that the Bible writers use the historical present, so it's present tense but happened in the past.
In the past, yeah.
So and Jesus goes here and does this. Well, he obviously went because he's not currently doing it.
Yeah.
So we just make it past tense.
Yeah.
But Mark's all present tense, and Mark is, which again we shouldn't steal too much thunder, but I've heard it likened to a shooting script. It's just all the action. It's all the stuff. You don't get a lot of the background. You get Jesus straight away went here and did that and did this and did that and said this and went here.
Which is why most scholars believe that the primary audience for Mark would have been more Gentile than Jewish, because he was just trying to get straight to the point. He didn't need all the Jewish Old Testament references in history, straight to the point. Perhaps even easier Greek and stuff like that appeals to a larger audience. So, yeah.
And hence none of the sayings and teachings.
Yeah, exactly.
That are in Q.
Yeah. And the only other point I would say on the primacy of Mark, unless you've got something, is we do see a little bit of the development of theology by the time of Matthew and Luke. I found a really fun example. In Mark 6:5, it says, when Jesus is in Nazareth, it says, Jesus could do no mighty work while he was there. And apparently, Matthew and Luke might have thought that verse might be a bit dishonoring to Jesus in the way it was phrased.
Yes.
Probably because of Mark's poor Greek. So
Poor fella. Not everyone's a high achiever.
Exactly.
It's nice that everyone's included in the Bible, right?
So Luke just gets rid of this verse completely. He's like, we're not going to say that about Jesus. Matthew changes it a bit. In 13:58, he says, he did not do many mighty works there. So kind of implying that he could have, and he did, just didn't do many. Yes. So there's
well, from my memory, that's because of the people's unbelief.
That's correct.
So
yeah. Whereas in Mark, it kind of looks like Jesus was unable to because of himself. Matthew makes it clear it's because of the people's unbelief. So there is a little bit of an effort by Matthew and Luke, most people think, to remove some of the crudeness of Mark's early presentations.
Which is a complex argument. I always struggle with this when I was doing my studies in Bible college. I did struggle with this kind of almost assumption that ancient peoples were kind of primitive people, and the earlier something is, the more primitive it is, and which to a level, obviously, it is. But also, we see a pretty quick succession. Like, this is all within a generation, and so we go from Mark to John within probably 30 or 40 years, and John's not just good Greek, but it's actually like conceptually so
beautiful,
bigger and grander and so much more crafted. And so it's complex to say that there was any major progression of kind of community learning between Mark and John. So I think, I've always I'm always skeptical about the primitive nature of ancient work as opposed to just the early nature of ancient work. But anyway.
We've got the huge benefit of centuries and centuries of scholarship and reflection.
Yeah. I mean, not to mention the fact that we had all those the patristic period, the early church fathers who were all amazing, who did so much. I mean, most Christians wouldn't know who Athanasius or Irenaeus is, and yet so much of what we experience today is on the shoulders of what
the Trinity is pretty much on Athanasius. So
thanks, buddy. He's against the world, but we love him.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of how we got to the fact that we have 4 Gospels. But the other thing which we're going to touch on next is what's going on in the world at the time of Jesus as we read him in the Gospels. We looked at how we got the Gospels. What is happening in the world when we get to the Gospels? The complex part of this, I think, and you can feel free to disagree, but I won't let you get a word in so you can't. No. It's hard because we've had the better part of 400 years of no biblical history recorded in our Bible. When we get to the end of the Old Testament, so Malachi in your Bible, but really technically 2nd Chronicles historically, there's a big gap. And we don't know what's going on in the world because we find the world very different at the opening of Matthew's Gospel.
That's right. We've got this little intertestamental period, is what we call it, of those 400 or so years between the end of the exile when the Jews find themselves back in Jerusalem, thanks to our Persian friends, and when we pick up again in the Roman Empire with the time of Jesus in the Gospels. And in between then, there's quite a number of empires and famous civilizations that take place. And like you said, we have no biblical history for it, so we're relying on other sources, some of which you would be familiar with, like the Maccabean books, which make their way into the Apocrypha and the Catholic Bible. So we got that a little bit. They're a bit biased, but they're there. And other than that, we're relying on we've actually got quite a lot of material from the Greek world, which came about that time with a lot of Renaissance in the literature and arts. So we've got a bit. But we kind of start our journey back at the end of the Old Testament with the Persian Empire.
Kind of really in Isaiah.
Yeah.
So we get Cyrus shows up, right?
Yeah, as the Messiah in Isaiah.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So there's the Persians who, they do all right. They last for a couple of hundred years. So they around kind of the middle of the 500s BC through to the around 332 BC. Referring to my notes here, that's not in my memory.
Around 332 BC.
Just approximately. But what happens at the end of the Persian kind of dynasties there is actually probably the most significant moment in that kind of intertestamental period is the Greek Empire. So Alexander the Great does his thing. He does his... By the age of 33, he's conquered the known world and lies back on his couch and is all depressed and full of existential angst because there's no new lands to conquer anymore. It's like, oh, yeah, my heart breaks for you, Alexander.
And then he promptly dies as well.
Well, that's because he's nothing to do.
Yeah, short life. Conquered India and then that's it.
We're done. I'm out. So there's the Greek period, which is Alexander the Great. At the end of his reign, some significant things have happened. So basically the Mediterranean world, right across then into the kind of the Middle East and Asia Minor, even to North Asia, is now Hellenized, which is a significant moment in world history because now we have what comes with Hellenization?
Yeah, so Hellenization, if you're not familiar with the concept of the word, is just the Greekness, the spreading Greekness of the world. So we'd probably describe this today as like the Westernization, especially of the Eastern world. And so for Judaism and Jews, this was incredibly significant because coming from the ancient Near East and even spending time in Egypt and stuff, they had a lot of what we would call Eastern and Oriental ideas inflicted into their religion of Judaism. So the Hellenization of the world played a huge factor in how the Jews were viewed over the next, especially 200 years after Alexander. It started to get not so pretty anymore for a lot of the Jews.
Yeah. What it did bring into was a lot of Greek philosophy. Mm-hmm. So those ideas, so the Aristotelian and Platonic philosophies started to kind of flow into what, like you said, was traditionally Eastern thinking. And so we get some really interesting kind of connection points and conflicts in thought and worldview. The other thing that's a big bonus, however, is language. So we get classical Greek becomes the language of living really across the Greek Empire, which is literally from Europe through to India.
Which is why we have so much more material from this period, because the language is common over such a large empire.
Which is really interesting, because we dovetail this kind of conversation with the Roman Empire. And so it's the bookend of this conversation, but really a lot of people think Rome was the perfect conditions for the gospel to spread. It's actually the Greeks that made the conditions right. The Romans just got everyone in line.
The Romans were the benefactors of the Hellenization of the world.
The Greeks invented and the Romans ruled, really.
Pretty much.
And so, but at the end of the Greek period, when Alexander dies, there's a power vacuum. There's a big problem. And he's got these 4 generals who are very powerful, who basically said, let's divide up Alexander's kingdom for ourselves, and we'll all take a bit each.
And they think it'll go well, and it really doesn't.
Well. Yeah. So we get in the Egyptian part, we get the Ptolemies, which is spelled with a P. So Ptolemies.
So keep in mind, these are all Greek rulers. Most people, when you tell them Ptolemy, they're like, "Oh, is that a pharaoh?" No. Just a Greek.
He took on the title. Took on the title of pharaoh because it's all the rage locally.
They needed to, but he was a Greek pharaoh, to put it that way.
So Cleopatra, Mark Antony, this is all as a result of the Greek general taking over Egypt. Who are the others? You're better at pronouncing their names than I am.
We've got Cassander. Where did Cassander end up again?
I think he's on the far west.
So France?
The western side of Italy, and I think maybe up into Europe.
Okay, yeah. We've got Antigonus, who ended up with most of what we would now say is Rome.
I think so,
Pretty central. I think Cassander was mostly Macedonia as well.
Oh, that's right.
It was his main.
If this is wrong,
place.
then forgive us.
No, what you said was right. It's not France, Macedonia. And then the last one we have is probably the one, along with Ptolemy, that is most important for our context with the Jews, is
the Seleucids.
The Seleucids.
So the Seleucid Empire, which, we'll get to Seleucids in a second, because first up, the Ptolemies take over pretty much that whole Levant area, so Israel, Palestine, right through North Africa. It's during this period, so this is around 300 to 200 BC-ish. It's at this time that we get the Septuagint, the LXX.
Because Greek is now spreading.
So they translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, which is what that is, even though it's using Roman numerals for a Greek Bible of a Hebrew scripture. But anyway, just in case you were wondering. So this lasts about 100 years, and then the Syrians take over. Now, the Syrians were actually just the Seleucid dynasty. So one of the 4 generals of Alexander, he had basically their descendants. I think it was Antiochus III, not Antiochus IV, who was Epiphanes.
No.
Love that. Antiochus Epiphanes.
Yeah.
Cracking name. Man, imagine that business card. Anyway, Antiochus III takes over.
He's not so cool.
Kicks the Ptolemies out and takes over Israel. And so there's this constant kind of, because it's the trade route, because it's kind of the connecting tissue between Africa and the resource of Africa and Europe and the population source of Europe, this is a very significant piece of property. And so it gets fought over all the time.
Yep. And basically up until the Seleucids are in occupation of Palestine, the Jews maintain relative autonomy underneath the Persians, the Greeks, and even the Ptolemies originally. They were allowed, they paid tribute obviously to their empires, but they were allowed their religious freedoms at least, which was good. Unfortunately, the Seleucids weren't so merciful in their rule, so a big event happens where the Seleucids are still fighting the Ptolemies and coming from Egypt, and also the emerging Romans as well. So they need money. What do? They ransack the Jewish temple, take all of its riches, turn it into a pagan temple. This is when we get a lot of persecution in this period, and a revolt begins, a rebellion.
Well, and so I think it seems historically the big event that caused this problem was that these Greek Syrian people took over, took all the good stuff, turned the temple into an altar to Zeus, and then sacrificed a pig on the altar.
Not good stuff for Jews.
Yeah, no. Jews not big on pork products at any level. And so,
let alone Zeus in their temple.
Yeah. Like there's so many things going on right now. So there's this, about 167 BC, there's what's called the Maccabean Revolt, which starts the Hasmonean dynasty.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes.
So there's the Maccabean Revolt, which begins the Hasmonean dynasty, which is now local Jewish people ruling Jewish people. It's like, no taxation without representation.
Exactly.
You know?
So our good friend Judas Maccabeus,
the Hammer.
Yeah,
that's his nickname, the Hammer. Up there with Athanasius.
It's so cool.
Maybe we get Athanasius in the front and Judas Maccabeus in the back.
Anyway,
stop. Hammer time.
It's probably his catchphrase to do the whole revolution, yeah.
Come on.
So Judas Maccabeus successfully leads this revolution to free Jerusalem from the Seleucid rule. And like you said he reestablishes Yahweh worship in the temple again. And that's actually where we get the celebration of Hanukkah from,
Exactly
which
right.
I found out.
The rededication of the temple.
So there's that. And he establishes this Hasmonean dynasty.
Which Jesus celebrates, actually.
Yeah, there you go. So much maligned Hanukkah is biblical precedent.
Oh, I know. Awkward.
So we get the Hasmonean dynasty, which is started roughly around 2 decades after the revolt ends by Judas Maccabeus' brother, I think it's Simon, and he's got a nice, funny second name as well, which I won't try and pronounce. And they last for probably about the next century, and they keep the Jewish autonomy in the region intact. But unfortunately, this ends eventually with the Romans attacking Jerusalem in a 3-month siege. If you've heard of Pompey, the great Roman general, he's in charge of this. And eventually Jerusalem gets overrun, and Herod the Great is appointed as king of the Jews by the Romans in about 37 BC.
Herod the Great.
Yes, self-titled. Now, this is not the Herod that you're familiar with from the Gospels.
No.
There's
there's 2 Herods in the Gospels.
Exactly.
So it's
and
very
neither of them are this one.
Herod the Great, yeah.
So this is the start of the Herodian dynasty, just after the Hasmonean dynasty. And so it's about 37 BC, just before the start of the Gospels and Jesus' birth in 0 AD. And Herod's son...
Or 6.
Herod... for historical convention that we're used to, 0 AD, but Jesus was probably not born in what we know as 0 AD. Herod the Great...
blew everyone's mind right there. What's going on?
That's for another time, everybody. Herod the Great is succeeded by his son, Herod Antipas.
Yep.
I think that's how we say it.
Not quite as great.
Not quite as great. He was never king. He likes to call himself that. And that's the Herod we know mostly of the two in the Gospels.
Yes. And so what's interesting in this period of time, which is quite significant, is that during the Hasmonean times, the priesthood isn't the proper priesthood. So the ruling council starts to introduce people who weren't from the Davidic line, weren't from the Levitical line, they weren't Zadokite priests. They were their own appointed people, which is why when we get to Jesus' time, it's all sorts of problems because the high priest isn't from the right family. They're a political position. Yeah. It's really complicated. So we get this happening around kind of middle of the 2nd century BC, the 140s, 150s. People start to leave Israel. So we get the establishment of the communities at Qumran, which was... they were called Essenes, which we'll get to in a moment.
Famous for the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Dead Sea Scrolls, yeah. And so we kind of start to see now this splintering of the Jewish kind of spiritual environment as people start to kind of become politicized or they want to withdraw from political influence. And then with Herod and the Herodian dynasties coming in, which is a political space because what happens is after Pompey comes in, they become puppets, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Herod is portrayed as really powerful in the Gospels, but in the grand scheme of things, he's just a small provincial governor. And
so it's really interesting too in the kind of the grand world stage at this point, having done a bit of reading into history of Rome and things like that. This is almost like a byline. Pompey's, kind of conquering of Israel and Palestine and that whole region is kind of just one of the things he did during his time as a general. So it's actually almost insignificant, really, on the grand scale.
It's not even what he's known for.
Yeah, but in the biblical narrative, this is a really, really important moment because it shifts everything. And so all of the conditions now we see so many prophecies fulfilled in the New Testament from the Old Testament are because of Rome, because of the census that's called, because of the Roman roads that have been established off the back of the Greek innovations. So the stage is set by this point, but it's not a good time.
No.
And
then enter Jesus.
Yeah.
So.
That's it. So he arrives at this point. And so he finds himself in a very interesting cultural space. So they've had Syrians, they've had Greek Egyptians or Egyptian Greeks, they've had Syrian Greeks or Greek Syrians, they've had Greeks just generally, they've had Romans, they've had their local people running it, they've had political parties, they've had spiritual people running it. Everything's gone on.
Yeah.
And so in the 300 years prior to Jesus, it's just been bedlam.
Yeah.
Just absolute bedlam. And so as we find ourselves reading the Gospels, that's why we have all these different groups of people because of all these things that have happened. So we get the high priests who, I was just saying, they're kind of a political faction.
They're now a political position, no real bearing on any religious significance,
Which is made up of a quasi-spiritual / political / moral group of people called the Sadducees.
Yeah.
Right? So they're kind of likened, this is a gross oversimplification, but they're kind of like liberal Hebrew people. So they've got a really liberal theology, as in, look, angels aren't real. The spiritual realm's not a thing. There's no resurrection of the dead. That whole stuff. It's all just, that's not our thing. I always remember it. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, and that's why they're sad, you see.
Oh, I've never heard that before. But there you go.
See? Makes sense, right? So the Sadducees, and so the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish ruling council, is heavily stacked by Sadducees because they're also the high priests.
Yeah.
They've
got very aristocratic, very
wealthy,
powerful, wealthy people. Yeah.
And so if you have that in mind as you're reading the Gospels, all of a sudden you see why they're making decisions, because their power base, their income, and their influence is threatened by Jesus. They're kind of counterbalanced in a very interesting way by the Pharisees.
Yes.
Who are like the exact opposite almost.
Yeah, they don't really improve on the Sadducees. They just counterbalance the wrong way.
Right?
Yeah.
So they're often provincial people. They're not rich people. They're the people who are really earnest in their faith quite often. I think the Pharisees probably get a bad rap.
Yeah.
Not in the Gospels, but actually in our reading of the Gospels. I think they get probably a harder gig than they need. So their whole thing was that the temple's really not effective. The high priests and the Sadducees are running it. It's not really that space where God dwells anymore. We will worship God most effectively and define ourselves by Torah observance, which is the law.
Which is what they should be doing,
worship.
To be fair to them.
Yeah,
so,
exactly right.
Yeah.
So they're often out in the provincial areas. They're poorer people. They're more common people. They're a widespread movement. People could get on board with being a Pharisee. It wasn't too much of an issue. And they actually become kind of the ascendant spiritual movement post what happens after Jesus' life, which is the Jewish the Jewish wars, really. With Rome, they come in, they destroy Israel.
Destruction of the temple again. Yep.
All destroyed. Final captivities, the diaspora happens, and so the Pharisees then become kind of the ruling spiritual force. That's why we get synagogues. That's why we get all of the Talmud and all that kind of stuff happens because of the Pharisees getting their gig. So that's those guys. And we mentioned before the Essenes, which was another group again who were interesting. One of the theories is John the Baptist was in the scene.
I've actually heard that, yes, especially because of his description with his clothing and his ascetic lifestyle and stuff like that.
Yep. So they're the ones who left when they didn't like the Maccabeans or during the Maccabean period. So they kind of pulled away to live in the desert. They believed in kind of more Jewish mysticism, so angels and demons and all that kind of stuff. So the spiritual realm was very rich and full. They were quite ascetic, so they would deny themselves. They practiced baptism or ritual baths. So they found ritual baths in their communities, so Qumran and places like that, where they had kind of removed themselves from everyday life. So they had a whole end times eschatology thing going on about what had to happen in order for God to restore Israel to,
Yeah, and they were actually waiting on a dual messianic kind of eschatological timeline. They were waiting for the priestly Messiah of the Aaronic line and then the Davidic Messiah.
So spiritual and your political Messiah.
Yes, and which we would say Jesus...
Check.
Yes, encompassed both. So
win. It's easy. Yeah. Then there was the zealots. So we find a few zealots kind of almost below the surface in the New Testament. So Judas Iscariot was potentially a zealot because the knives that the zealots would carry was a very similar sounding word to Iscariot, the same derivation. And so he was maybe known by the weapon he carried because he was part of the political movement that was zealots, which are really kind of like freedom fighters, like almost like terrorists.
I've actually heard them called the Jewish terrorists before. They were willing to take matters into their own hands and use violence. They often operated like not as corporate terrorism as we know today, but as assassinations and things like that were more common in the ancient world. So
when we see scenes like the crowd, Jesus perceived that the crowd were going to make him king by force. We're kind of assuming that this is actually alluding to maybe that there was zealots stirring up kind of this, let's take over, let's get back to, Israel ruled by Israelites. So that's going on. And then we find people like the priests and the Levites and the scribes, the teachers of the law, these people who kind of had vested interests, who were kind of either on the payroll of the Sadducees and the high priests or actually were themselves. And so you can see why they're constantly seeking to kill or control or silence Jesus. And I suppose the only other big group of people that we should mention is the Samaritans at this point, because they don't show up a lot in the Gospels, but when they do show up in the Gospels, it's always a significant moment.
Yeah, so when they do show up in the Gospels, they're usually being contrasted or compared with the Jews because historically, that's their history together. So the Samaritans were, well, I guess are Jews originally from the northern kingdom of Israel following the exile, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in the history, but basically they're not on very good terms with the Jews, and Samaria becomes its own little hidey hole with that little group growing. And yeah, by the time of the Gospels, they're still not really on great terms.
Yeah, because in part of it is, so 722 when the northern kingdoms are taken into captivity by the Assyrians. So now, if my memory serves me correctly, the Assyrians' deportation policy was quite different to the Babylonians. And so a number of people stayed behind and other people were shipped in so that they kind of distracted the power bases so that people there wasn't a lot of people to gather together. So they kind of remove and replace. And so over generations, those people intermarried and intermingled. And so there was this kind of almost arrogance about the southern kingdom, the Judah, Israel, looking at the northern kingdom as you've intermarried, you've intermixed, you're interracial now, and you've not stayed pure to who God's called us to be as a nation, because right through the Torah, there's all these rules about marrying foreigners and things like that. And so there's this huge xenophobia and this kind of really kind of judgmental view of these are kind of a poor reflection of who God's called us to be. And so they had their own space for worship, which is why in John 4, Jesus is saying, some people say worship on this mountain, other people say worship on this mountain. So there's fights over where true worship should happen. So that's a really big deal in Jesus' time. That do we go north with the Samaritans? Do we go south? Complicated by the fact that Jesus lived in the north, so Galilee is up north near the Samaritans, and so there's this awkwardness of our proximity is close, but our beliefs are completely separate. So it's all going on. It's a crazy time.
Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, they're kind of seen as a half race, a mix and match of things they really shouldn't have been because of disobedience to the Torah, and that's why they're often used as an example by Jesus. Obviously. The Samaritan who stops to help the person on the side of the road. You guys look down on the Samaritans, but he's the only one who stopped to do my work. Yeah. So the Samaritan's often used, and same with the Samaritan woman at the well, as the point of Jesus' parables to speak to the Jews and say, what you guys doing?
Yeah. So that raises the space that there was temple worship was important, but synagogues were starting to be established further from Jerusalem. There was the Decapolis, which Jesus goes to, which is full-on Roman, Greek, kind of pagan worship centers and worship. There's the awkwardness of Israel in the north and Israel in the south with the Philistines and the Samaritans in between. And so when Jesus travels south to Jerusalem, that's not just a simple, I'm just going through some Jewish neighborhoods to get to the capital city. It's actually quite a significantly dangerous time. Hence, they go via the river, follow the Jordan down because it's a bit safer, but all the robbers were there. So you get this really interesting kind of village life is happening, but there's a couple of big cities. There's all these different classes. There's all these different considerations of what they would say race, even though they're pretty much all cousins anyway. Yep. And so all of this is kind of the situation we find ourselves in when we read the Gospels.
And I guess the only other group we haven't really mentioned, mostly because they're not really a group, they're sort of isolated figures, but the number of messiahs, or self-proclaimed messiahs that happened just before and during Jesus' time is also pretty significant. The number of people, there's quite a lot of famous ones who gathered quite large followings and incited violence and everything and tried to start rebellions.
There's some more in the Bible.
Exactly. And I think they're named and stuff like that as well. So
isn't there a Thaddeus?
Yeah. And there's another
Gamaliel in Acts, I think, chapter 4 from memory, when the disciples are in front of the Sanhedrin.
I always thought it was Gamaliel, but yes, sure. Whichever way you say that name, he's another one.
The G-man. Yeah. He quotes other messiahs that raised up and said, basically, if this is from God, then why would you oppose it? And if it's not from God, it won't succeed. So everybody chill out.
So for when Jesus came through as exactly like that, as another Messiah, everyone's going, it's not like, this is a huge radical thing. No. To some people it was, but a lot of them would have been like, we've seen 5-10 messiahs in the last 3 years try to start rebellions, and it hasn't worked.
Well, Judas Maccabeus was seen
exactly,
as a Messiah.
yeah.
So there's this real strong, and you see this constantly through the Gospels when you start to notice, is that they keep saying, when are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? When is Israel going to be back in charge of Israel? And so the Messiah was quite often seen as a political figure, like you were saying before, that there's the priestly figure and the kingly figure, so king/politics. So you get this real sense that the people didn't know what they were looking for. Even though Jesus says you're supposed to know, those who had eyes to see knew because they had been paying attention. But there's this general kind of feeling that people just didn't want to be ruled by Rome. They were sick of being kind of made slaves and subjugated, and they wanted a way out. And Jesus came and didn't do it the way they wanted.
Not the way they wanted, but
the way they needed.
And all through the Bible, that's the story of the Bible. Throughout the Old Testament, the Jews' story is their struggle for freedom from captivity in Egypt, through to exile under the Babylonians and the Assyrians and stuff. It was always their autonomy that was at stake, and the dream of the promised land and having their own freedom. And even with all these empires like the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and stuff just before Jesus, all they want is their autonomy back and for Jesus to put them back on top and be their king. Instead, he grants them, hey, you guys are citizens of heaven and you don't belong to this earth.
So everyone's like, what?
Oh, you come on, man. Like, yeah.
Nice try.
But for us today, and maybe some of them back then, that's the message that Jesus gave us and the one we need.
So hopefully now, as you start to read the Gospels, or continue to read the Gospels, hopefully you have read them before. If you're listening to a podcast that goes for this long about the Gospels, maybe not your first
rodeo,
your first shot at it. But maybe now you'll start to see there's a whole lot more going on right below the surface when we start to scratch this a little bit, that it's possibly the most volatile time it's ever been for the places and the people that we find in the Gospels. And so tensions are high. Jesus steps in when it's a powder keg about to blow.
It's a cliffhanger.
So, it's really exciting and really intense. And so, as we've gone through this, hopefully that's going to help you see and engage with the Gospels a little more deeply. Any final thoughts before we land this thing?
Not really. Just excited to keep going.
Come on. So we have hopefully some guests coming up that'll enlighten us a little bit about a few things. And we'll jump into Mark's Gospel first, I reckon. I think let's do it. Mark,
in order of
Matthew,
primacy,
Luke, John, just to mess things up. Anyway, so yes, we'll dig into the Gospels. We'll spend some time looking at that and maybe talk a little bit more about what else was happening and how we can find our way to the historical figure of Jesus. But all that will come in our subsequent episodes of Bible Streams. Thanks so much for joining us. Like, subscribe, do all those things. It actually helps other people find it when you do. Thank you, Alex.
Pleasure.
Always a pleasure to hang out with you and talk about the good book.
Yeah, absolutely. Right back at you.
The God Spell. So good. So if I had a 70s musical track to play, I would, but I shan't. Instead, I'll just bid you a fond farewell.
Yeah. Be on the lookout for that merch, the Athanasius, the Hammer merch. Yeah.
Stop. Hammer time. Thanks for listening to this episode of Bible Streams. We'll be back next time with our second episode in Jesus Stories.
Thanks for listening to this River Life podcast. Make sure you subscribe to keep up to date with all the latest content. If this podcast has raised any questions for you, contact us via church@riverlifechurch.org.au or through Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for listening.